Thank you, and salutations to all the respected ministers, on the officials and the various high commissioners who are participating in the session. In the spirit of having a Talanoa session, I would like to essentially, talk about some of the key issues that we as Pacific Islanders obviously faced as a result of the pandemic, which has obviously had a huge impact on our economies. More so in particular those who were very dependent on service industries, in particular Fiji, for example. 40% of our GDP was dependent on the tourism sector. As a result of the borders obviously shutting down globally, it had a huge impact on government's ability to collect revenue, and of course a catastrophic impact from one perspective on the employment of our people. So we had over 100,000 people who almost overnight lost their jobs. We then, of course, had the spiraling effect of those people who worked in the tourism sector and those who, in fact, were dependent on the tourism sector, not directly but indirectly. They obviously also had a loss of income or lost their jobs also. So it presented to us, obviously, a scenario that we had never envisaged before. I don't think anybody, globally speaking, envisaged that in the 21st century the borders would actually shut down. And that's precisely what happened. What does one do in such circumstances, in particular if your revenue has been shot, and of course it creates a lot of unemployment? We of course took a very forward-looking approach to it. What we essentially did was to ensure that we did not have the deleterious impact of socioeconomic issues on our population generally, because if you do not manage that well, of course, it can not only cause hardship, but it can also cause social unrest. When people are hungry, when people need food, they can obviously become very unrestful, and we had to cater for that, of course. Secondly, what was the long-term strategy in terms of dealing with the medical situation itself? So our target was to ensure that we get a very high rate of vaccination. We had a no jab, no job policy in place. We put various incentives in place that incentivize people to actually, go and get the jab, get fully vaccinated within a very short period of time. And in that respect, we are very grateful to the governments of India, Australia, and New Zealand, and of course later on the Americans, who actually supplied us the vaccines free of charge. And we of course had to bear the cost of the administration of it, but that was very paltry compared to the fact that we were able to access vaccine so quickly in a short period of time. So which meant that Fiji became one of the highest vaccinated countries, developing countries in the world, which enabled us to open up our borders. Concomitantly, of course, we had a program in respect to, as I mentioned, about the socioeconomic issues. So we rolled out a very comprehensive unemployment benefit scheme. So those people who were in the formal sector, I should say, were allowed to withdraw their funds from the general account in the Provident Fund, or what we call in Fiji National Provident Fund, or some countries call superannuation. And if they did not have those funds, then government actually paid a stipend, if you like, every fortnight. This totaled to about $205 million. And at the same time, we rolled out various incentives for those in the informal sector, by giving cash disbursements. And all of this was done on the money wallets through the phones, where it took 3 minutes to apply. You applied through the phone, you actually got paid through your money wallets on the phone with a matter of seconds. This helped us, of course, in the meantime to develop very good data in respect to where people were, what sectors they worked in, number of males and females, etc., which gives us very good data in terms of socioeconomic planning also. We were able to then, altogether we rolled out about $430 million in what we call the COVID-19 Unemployment Benefit Scheme. This injection of funds was critically important to ensure that the economy actually did, plod along. Apart from the fact that it did give people a particular relief in terms of their ability to buy food, to be able to pay rent, pay for electricity, and meet their other expenses, it meant that there was money being injected into the economy. And the funding, of course, had to be borrowed, given the fact that we still we still had revenue sources were still fairly depleted. We had still not in any way compromised our overall policy framework, which was we still continued with free education. We still provided a poverty alleviation scheme, the poverty, what we call social welfare payments, that all continued. The free water for those below a particular level of household income levels, the people who, for example, got discounted electricity costs, etc. All of that continued. In conjunction with that, of course, we rolled out, things like paying the market vendors fees for 1 year. Fishermen, when they went to apply for the license, we actually paid the fishermen, fisherwomen. We paid for their licenses. All of that was done. Drivers who held PSV licenses, when they went for renewal, we paid for that. Also, birth certificates were paid for at the same time. So a number of the initiatives were actually put in place to ensure that people did not have to fork out money for what one may consider sort of day-to-day, living expenditure. Money, of course, had to be borrowed, and as a result of that, of course, our debt to GDP ratio has gone up to 88.4%. It was a double whammy, if you like, because of the fact that the border shut down, the tourism sector essentially shut down altogether. Our GDP overall contracted. There was contraction in the growth, and at the same time, of course, our revenues were depleted, and we also borrowed. So our debt to GDP ratio went up to 88.4%. Total debt stock is about 9.1 billion Fijian dollars. However, as the recent ANZ report does show, that this debt is sustainable. And one of the reasons why they're saying it is sustainable, because the actual borrowing of the funds was not borrowed willy-nilly. It was done in a strategic manner. It was also to ensure that we put in place various, what we call take a preemptive position. When the borders do open up, we're able to capitalize on those initiatives that actually had been put in place. And so therefore our borrowing stock actually increased substantially from offshore borrowing. Normally we'd like to cap our borrowing at about 70-30 if you like, 70 domestic plus or minus 5% and foreign borrowings, but we in fact went more for foreign borrowings. This is assisted on two ways why we did that. One, of course, was to be able to ensure that we maintained a particular level of foreign reserves, because that's one of the things that you can actually have vulnerability to, that if you have a major source of foreign revenue from tourism, if that's sort of stopped altogether, then you may have a problem with your foreign reserves. We already had a fairly good or healthy foreign reserves situation, but by us borrowing from offshore, we were able to ensure that today our foreign reserve sits at about $3 billion, which is about in excess of about 8 months worth of trading, which surpasses the international benchmark of about 3 months. So that was there, but it also was assisted by the fact that we were able to access a lot of concessional financing. We in fact accessed about $900 million through the World Bank, ADB and JICA in particular. We received huge, highly concessional financing. The rates actually are quite significant. So some of the interest rates with JICA were actually 0.01%, payable over 40-year period, 10-year grace period, and that makes it highly concessional. If you extrapolate that over a 40-year period, you're looking at about a 60% grant element in that by the time you end up paying that loan. So in fact, only 40% of it is in fact a loan per se. And then with the IDA funds from the World Bank, again we received concessional financing. Some of it was 40-year loan payment, 0% interest rate, but a 0.75% service fee. So overall, I mean, this concessional financing made it a lot easier for us, and I'd like to thank and put on record our thanks to World Bank and ADB and of course JICA for that matter. I think significantly what for us is critically important is to ensure that in all of this that we as a region are able to understand that it's critically important to have that level of transparency within our own governmental systems, as far as your finances are concerned. We have been on a trajectory, if you like, of policy reforms even prior to COVID. And in particular in the past 2-3 years, that trajectory has even been enhanced quite significantly, where by us meeting a number of policy reforms, we're able to get this concessional financing. So, in terms of reforming our laws pertaining to financial transparency and the ability to attract more private sector investment into the country, having a medium to long-term debt management or medium-term debt strategy, it has helped us quite significantly. I think also by making sure that we had this policy as a strategy in place, it helped us avoid a devaluation of the dollar, which would have been catastrophic actually. Because if we had been in that position, as all of us know now in the Pacific, because most of us in the Pacific are essentially importers of nearly everything we consume or everything we use. And therefore you have that vulnerability to, whether it's international commodity price increase or whether it's in terms of the supply chain issues that is actually affecting the ability to supply, and the demand is much greater. So we've seen, price of fuel, wheat, mobile phones, whatever else it is that we buy in the Pacific has increased exponentially. There is, of course, prediction that the price of fuel will probably increase by another 30 cents a litre in the next couple of months. So those are the Pacific Island countries that are vulnerable because of this, because most Pacific Island countries actually use fossil fuel to generate electricity. Huge, impact. Not just on the cost or to the ordinary consumer, but also in terms of the businesses, etc. So you'll see an escalation of prices. The cost of freight, from what we understand, recently we had a discussion with Swire Shipping. It will continue to increase. They're expecting some sort of panning out or leveling or plateauing or whatever economic term one wants to use, the jargon. Essentially, they're looking around about October or November or so, where it probably come to some reasonable pricing level. So, of course, as a government, we have had to, in this period also, in order to ensure that our national carrier, which also provides a quite significant connectivity to many of the Pacific Island countries, like, Kiribati and Tuvalu, the ability to come to the Pacific Island countries or other Pacific Island countries, or indeed get out of the Pacific Island countries to go to other destinations, very much dependent on Fiji Airways and Fiji Link. So government, in fact, increased its guarantee. We did not provide any direct cash funding from taxpayers' funds, as, for example, the New Zealand government did for Air New Zealand. But we essentially increased our guarantees for them to be able to ensure that the financiers still had confidence in the particular period which Fiji Airways was going through. And of course, ADB has provided, I understand, for the first time to the aviation sector financing in the Pacific at the very least. So that, of course, has increased our overall government contingent liabilities. But we believe in the next couple of years, given in particular now we've seen the forward bookings with the borders opening up, we saw a small rush of tourists coming to come to Fiji, predominantly from Australia and USA. New Zealand now opening up its borders. Hopefully we'll see a lot more Kiwis in Fiji. And the forward bookings from the month of April going forward looks pretty positive. So I think that, of course, will ensure that that investment in terms of guaranteeing Fiji Airways will pay its dividends. I think going forward is critically, like I mentioned, it's critically important for us to understand that as Pacific Island countries, we need to maintain the particular or higher levels of transparency in how we manage our economies. One of the issues that is completely beyond our control, of course, like we had with the pandemic, is climate change. And that's putting enormous pressure on our ability to be able to not just meet the SDG goals, but be able to just offer day-to-day, services. We've seen so many occasions in the past number of years where we've had to direct our resources from specific projects, whether it's electrification projects, whether it's road building, or any other initiative driven through the respective ministries or the independent agencies. We have to redirect funds from there simply to meet the rehabilitation costs of climatic events. And And that's put enormous pressure on us. Cyclone Winston, in 2016, within 36 hours, wiped off 1/3 of the value of our GDP. Over $200 million spent simply rebuilding schools that government does not even own. Government only owns about 10 or 11 schools in Fiji. The rest of the schools, in fact, are owned by various faith-based organizations or community-based organizations. Yet we have, of course, a moral and ethical obligation to rebuild the schools. And then, of course, infrastructure. Recently we've seen in Fiji, for example, even though it was not a cyclone, the amount of rain we received has washed away highways completely. Between Singatoka and Nandi, there's a huge gap in Kambisi. Those of you know Fiji well. Entire highway is gone. We have to rebuild that. Lanes, the 2 lanes, we got 1 lane, so already there's a landslide. Bridges, Irish crossings, etc. All of this actually mount up. So we are in a way in a catch-22 situation, because we tend to do rehabilitation works when, in fact, if we had the time and the right amount of funding at the right time, we could actually build resilience into this infrastructure. So the next time there's a climatic event, we don't actually have to rebuild because it won't get damaged. And that's the problem. And I think it's a bit of a catch-22 situation. So you have something that we want to rebuild, we want to build on, to better standards, but unfortunately, because we have so many of these occurrences of climatic events, we simply do what we call a quick rehab work. There's so much to do, because if we actually, build a bridge properly the way it should be designed, or have it at a higher level, it costs a lot more money. But then you won't be able to do rehabilitation works in dozens of other places because you have limited funds available. So we're in this constant kind of catch-22 situation. So for us, that's one of the critical issues. So to be able to, whenever the occasion arises, we build the resilience, we build sort of the capacity in the infrastructure. So overall, that would be my contribution. I think one of the things that we've also done by also borrowing from offshore and sustaining from offshore has been that we've got liquidity in the system now, and that's critically important, because if the economy bounces back, people need to be able to invest, people need to be able to rebuild, and the private sector in particular needs to drive that growth. And if they have access to funds that are at an affordable rate, then you'll be able to see that uptake of capital investment, and quite significantly, which of course will create a lot more jobs and also build a lot more resilience in your economy. So that would be sort of my introductory remarks. That's okay. Thanks.